Ooh, welcome to the channel, ghosts and ghouls. I wanted to do something for spooky season. I was on a bit of a time crunch though because of another project completely unrelated to the channel, so this came out a little later than initially planned. We're taking existing and iconic monsters and turning them into Genshin designs. Since Genshin has very few spooky adjacent designs, like most of them being witches, I figured this would be a fun little challenge. My goals with these designs was that they'd be recognizable as their original inspiration and could still read as believable designs for playable characters. We shall see if I succeed. Let's get started. For the first design, I chose the vampire. I had Dracula in mind, but honestly, I've never actually read the book or watched any of the movies, so generic vampire is more of the vibe here. Some will say we actually do have a vampire-inspired character with Rosaria, but they'd be wrong. Maybe not entirely wrong, but I wanted a character that was an actual vampire here. First thing first, I had to decide on what gender I wanted for my vampire. As an homage to the very first vampire in literature, Carmilla, I made her a young woman. I decided she'd be from an old aristocratic family in Mondstadt that had secluded themselves in their old mansion somewhere in the middle of the woods. Once all that was decided on, I could finally move on to the next phase, the mood board. I don't usually spend that much time on these for them to be relevant, but for this project, to make things smoother for myself, I decided to really spend time on the research and really lean on the mood board for the character creation. A lot of the stuff on there was outfit, hairstyle, and makeup inspo, but I also used Hoyo art like ZZZ's Vivian and this specific skirt concept art to kind of see how they designed a vampire or vampire adjacent girl. I basically took all the major decisions for the character look during this phase before finally moving on to the sketching. Usually I sketch stuff on Procreate, but this time I went back to my cheap, messy, and way too worn out for how actually new it is sketchbook. I drew out variations on her design with a pen so I wouldn't be too precious with my doodles, testing out the different ideas from my mood board. I even played around with the idea of giving her a bat form. Once I felt more or less inspired, I moved to the hardest part of the process, finalizing the design and adding colors. Because I was fully committed to doing things differently, I first created a base of the design and used it to iterate and test different colors, play around with the dress, until I finally stumbled on something I liked. With the design settled on, I moved to the illustration. The first idea for this whole thing was to make some cool splash art for all the design, but I decided it would be a little more reasonable to make something simple with just a basic pose and a basic background. For my vampire girl, it took me a few tries to figure out what I wanted to do, with stylized bats flying about and roses at her feet ended up being the perfect pose. Following what I'd done in a previous video, I did a full cleaned up sketch before working on the line art. With her aristocratic background in mind, I leaned into the big puffy dress look. I wanted her to have both a bat and a rose theme. The first thing I did with the bat theme was to actually give her hair these fake bat ears, very reminiscent of Deia's own hair. I thought the shape looked very appealing and it made it easier to figure out how her hair would frame her face. I gave her a bun shaped like a rose based on my mood board, but it's not at all visible from the front. I do think it would work for an actual Genshin character, since in-game you see their back fairly often. For her outfit, I incorporated the bat motif into her coat, giving it 2 pairs of wings, 2 in the front and the coat tails in the back. Her skirt is also lined with very cartoony bats. I liked how sharp they looked and it was a nice alternative to giving her dress some frills. The rose motif ended up being a lot more prevalent than I initially intended. At first it was just her hair, which felt like too little, so I added thorns as her coat lining, but also as decorations on her sleeves and her tights, but that still didn't feel like enough, so I added some rose on a ribbon around her waist, on the thorn adornments of her sleeves, and then I just went all out and gave her a petticoat made entirely of roses. Which, you know, was fine when you're just sketching and having fun. But then I actually had to draw all those roses during the line art phase, which was so much fun. With all the roses everywhere, I did want to make her a dendro user at first. I even thought about putting her vision in the big rose on her hip. But while working on the colors, specifically of her bats, I ended up really liking the idea of her actually being a pyro user, with her bats being pyro constructs. It also felt a little ironic since fire is used to kill vampires. That being said, her pyro vision could also explain how she could walk around in the sun if she were an actual character. So you know what? Big brain idea. In the end, it's not really visible. I kind of imagined it'd be in the back of her design. And here's the final illustration. I really love how she looks in the end. I think she's a pretty plausible Genshin design, so that part was a success. As for her being recognizable as a vampire, yeah, that's also 100% a success. But to be fair, vampires are pretty straightforward concepts with easily recognizable tropes to them. Our next design is Frankenstein's monster. For this design, I really wanted to reference Mary Shelley's original description of the monster as the main inspiration, while still of course referencing Universal's version of the character. I sorta had a very vague concept of him being resurrected by a researcher from Fontaine's Research Institute through some not very ethical means. The idea of that researcher possibly being one of his parents also floated around, but I'll admit I kinda didn't really use the concept, but that's why I have a Fontaine researcher on my mood board. Just like with Vampire Girl, a lot of the images were outfit inspirations, with Junji Ito's design being there mostly for vibes, although I did move away from that concept in the end. I wanted my design to have a mechanical arm, so I saved some pictures of Specialist Mechs as reference. The Wrightsley concept art was mostly there because I wanted my guy to have some prominent scars other than his stitch-up skin, and it felt like a good reference for what that would look like in Genshin. With all that settled, I started sketching. I found design ideas a lot quicker than with Vampire Girl. I did decide to go from the gloomy, kinda spooky vibe that Junji Ito's design inspired to something sadder and more melancholic during the sketching phase. And then I moved to design iterating, thinking it would go super smoothly. It did not! I had a lot of trouble with his outfit, honestly. I started with very muted colors, but he felt too muddy. And adding colors on top didn't really feel like it worked, so I ended up giving him a much flashier look than initially intended. But if it works, it works! For the illustration, I started with a slouch pose with him holding a claymore, but I got rid of it during the clean sketch phase because I really did not want to design a weapon for him. I also figured showing off his mechanical arm would be a little more interesting. At this point, I didn't really have an idea for the background, but I had faith in future me to come up with something amazing. To reference Mary Shelley's original design, I gave him long hair, one side being straight, dark hair, and the other being spiky. Unlike my color sketch, I decided the spiky side would be fully white with purple stripes, although you'll see that when I actually get to the colors. I didn't keep the initial ribcage chain ideas from the mood board and sketches, replacing them with a bunch of belts. I can't remember what gave me the idea, but they felt more interesting and added to the mismatched patchwork look I was going for. I also totally forgot to give him a vision. So you know what, it's in the back, just like with Vampire Girl. That was totally planned. But, credit what credit is due, I did actually choose an element for him, which was Electro, because, well, when I first started working on his design, I wanted him to look like he lived in isolation, and just like his body, his clothes were a patchwork of scraps. The concept did change a tiny bit. Instead of him living alone in, like, the woods or something, I liked the idea of him living somewhere secluded with the parent who'd resurrected him, with them probably being the one mending his clothes to the best of their abilities. His boots and the single glove were pretty much copied from the mood board inspiration. For the coats, I kinda winged it, honestly. I feel like I could have given it more hints that it was made in Fontaine, since it's the most prominent part of the design. I did also try to give his shirt a more patchwork look, with it actually being 3 different shirts sewn together, but like, the belts kind of hide it, so it's not super visible. For his mechanical arm, I went for a mix between the Specialist Mix arm and something vaguely steampunk looking, if that makes any sense. Once I put down all the base colors, I did have to decide what to do with the background, and ended up settling for a cemetery during a foggy night. Pretty simple, but once I decided on it, it made rendering a lot easier and straightforward, because now I at least had kind of a vibe to go with. Also, please ignore the tombstones with crosses on them. I completely forgot they don't look like that in Genshin. I really should have checked. Here's the final illustration. I did go back and bombarded my boy with the liquefied tool because he was looking kinda wonky. I also got rid of the bandages on his arm since they didn't really feel like they matched the vibe of his design. And another tiny little detail that I changed was his slightly hidden eye went from red to blue. But enough of that. Does this work as a plausible Genshin design? I don't think so. I feel like he's a little too mangled in the face to be a playable character, but kinda really like how it looks. Maybe he could actually work as a story-relevant NPC? I'm personally not giving myself points for that. As for him being recognizable as Frankenstein's monster, definitely. Just like with the vampire, the visual tropes for this guy are fairly well known and easy to recognize. Our final design is the creature from the Black Lagoon. Guys, this design was so difficult. I don't know why I thought this one would be like a good idea. First of all, this was the mood board. Extremely sparse compared to the other two. Since the original movie was set in the Amazon rainforest, I figured this version of the character would be from the closest thing to it in Genshin, Sumeru's Dharma Forest, specifically the sub-area of Apam Woods. It felt like a good place to have a creature living in secret there, with all the underground tunnels and the fact it's submerged during the day. I wanted the creature to basically live in the wilderness with very little interaction with humans. So far, so good. For the design, I figured as long as it looks fish-like, it should be recognizable. I also wanted it to have clothing made out of rags and leaves, and I thought maybe giving it algae as like hair could be interesting. So with all that in mind, I moved to sketching. I was immediately confronted with how difficult it was to make a design that both looked like good work in Genshin and was recognizable as the creature from the Black Lagoon. I tried a bunch of sketches with algae hair, but this thing is bald! I can't just give it hair, so no hair, but also I couldn't just let it walk around bald. So I gave it a cloak with a hood. I did try to give it a lily pad as a hat, but that looked way too cute. Because the creature is just naked in the original, I decided something like a loincloth would work best and took inspiration from Hillage Earls, which I definitely should have added to my mood board. Once I settled on what I wanted, I drew a base for the design digitally and then I just kept struggling. You'd think a swamp creature wearing a loincloth and a hooded cape would be easy. But no! This was, in fact, a nightmare. And not a spooky one, just extremely annoying and tedious. Eventually, I did choose a color scheme that didn't look too horrendous, and things went smoother from there. Since this design was already kind of out there for a potential Genshin design, I decided to just do my thing, and I drew him in a more feral pose with a snarling face, and for the background, I chose a swamp. As I mentioned earlier, for its design, I took a lot of cues from Hilly Churls for the clothing. I gave it a necklace with bones and knickknacks, and more importantly, its vision! Finally, I don't forget to add one to my design! I really like the idea of the vision being more of a really cool trinket to it, rather than a divine gift, probably because it doesn't really understand what it's supposed to be. I wanted the cloak and hood to be covered in moss and lily pads to really show it's constantly in water. I also put a wrap around its hood, pinned together with this huge jewelry piece, both of which I made reminiscent of what eremites would wear, implying these articles of clothing were taken from random travelers. It probably doesn't hurt people to get its clothes, at least that wasn't the idea. You know what? I changed my mind. It's spooky season. Maybe the creature can hurt people as a treat. Once I got to the background, I ended up not referencing Appam Woods at all and just drew a more typical swap. I had a very specific image in my mind, and that sort of made me forget the original plan I had. Oops. Here is the final illustration. Definitely very different from most Genshin design, especially since it's bald. So I'd say this one doesn't quite pull off the plausible playable character look. I don't know if it reads as a creature from the Black Lagoon either, so I'd say it didn't quite succeed there either. But you know what? I quite like this feral little cryptid. And there we go! Woo! Hope this video wasn't too spooky. Definitely had fun despite how hectic it was to work on these. I got to try some new stuff, so that was pretty cool. I'd love to know what you guys thought of everything. Thoughts on the design? On the format? Perhaps? If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe for more spooky videos. Oh, there will be no more spooky videos. Subscribe anyway. As always, thanks for watching, have a spooky Halloween, and see you next time. Bye bye!